Okay. Good morning. Good morning. Okay. So what did we see yesterday? Let's just go back. Um, you need to know with absolute certainty before you borrow something of your friend that he doesn't mind. Um, um, and it has to be something that is not a consumable. So that we've already seen together. Okay. And then we saw yesterday in the Biurim that if you do end up damaging your friend's object, you will have to end up paying for it. So that was the next thing that we saw. Um, and then we saw yesterday in Lamedalid, Shoel Shalomidas Haba Olam, you can borrow things that um, um, you can borrow things from your friend, but if you take it without his permission and it's not something that you're absolutely certain that he doesn't mind, so then Shol Shalomidas Haba Olam Buhu Gazlan. And he said over here that mutter lishol mibnei beso shel balabayas devarim sherigilim ha'olam lahashil l'shchenim umakiri. That you're allowed to borrow from the other members of the household. If let's say you have a pattern of borrowing, the trimming shears from your friend, whatever you call those, the shrubbery trimmers, and and he's not home, and he's perfectly okay with you because you've done it before, it would be okay to borrow from his wife if he's not home. Do you mind if you, or the other members of the house? So in the Biurim over here, he says, V'yesh le'ayin, ha'im shari lish'ol davar mibnei beito shel balabayas b'li yediyaso. Are you allowed to borrow something from the other members of the household of the homeowner without his knowledge? He says the truth is that at first glance it would seem problematic because the Shulchan Aruch writes as follows: if there's a utensil that is being that the son has or that his servant has, his butler has, if you borrow it from the son or the housekeeper, so then you're shol shalomidas, and that's a type of gezela. Because of sham hasma sivkat and zayin demashma desvirle, that filu lakcho miyad beno hagadol shel balabais birshuso de beno, afilu hakim mikri shol shalomidas, given shena shel beno ela shel aviv ad kan devarav. Smar writes, this is not just when you borrow something from a little kid. Even if the child is legally an adult, he's a teenager, he's in his 20s and he's living at home, and he lends you his father's thing, it sounds like from the language of the Shulchan Aruch that you're still in violation. V'ra'isi b'sefer minchas pitim simin shinun chesif dalid, shehevi b'shem maharil shenoagim lishol b'liyadiyas haba olam b'hutama al zeh. And the Minchas Pitim says that people don't regard this halacha. People generally will borrow things from the child of the dad without bothering to inquire. He says, and he quotes from the Likutei Maharil Kasav Ha, the minag pasha to shol adam klebayis chaver shalo biydiyaso. And he says the reason why people take liberties with this is because we assume a person is happy to lend people things and People benefit from his assets. And the Maharil is bothered by this because he says that it's generally, you can only make that assumption when it comes to something that is a mitzvah item, like a talis. There we say people are happy that their assets should be used to let other people do mitzvahs. But just your shrubbery trimmers, who said, or where do you get off that you can just take liberties with this and borrow this from one of the other members of the household without asking the balabayas? So he says, "V'hine hada kasav asma hanal degam belokeach mibno shel balabayas havishol shalom midas nira lanias daiti tahinu b'dvarim yikarim ba'alei erech she'ein derech kol kach lahashilam la'acher." He says, it would seem to me that the only time that there's a problem borrowing something from the child of the owner is when it's something of value where not everyone would lend it out. But if it's a trifling kind of appliance where the owner regularly lends these things out, that you could lend out. In other words, once there's been an established pattern that the guy always lends this stuff out, then there's certainly nothing wrong with borrowing it from his child. Even if the owner is not aware. I'm going to bring you a proof, he says. Because we learned in Siman Dalid that it is permitted for the son of the balabayas to give a piece of bread to a poor person, or to a child, a family friend. It's permitted for my children to serve guests who come to my home or are hungry. It's permitted for my children to give my food to other people. He says, "Lefisha kach nagu balabatim." He says, because that's the norm. He says, whenever my wife goes shopping, it's with the understanding that my children have free reign to share this with their friends, if they would like to. Okay? So that's what the Rav Shulchan Aruch had written. This is because that's the expectation. They're not going behind my back when they give a glass of soda to someone who comes over to the house. There are people that there's this one guy who comes over my house more often than I would like, but it's not that I begrudge him the glass of seltzer. It's that I just wish he wouldn't come over as much. But nothing I can do about it. So it's got nothing to do with the financial aspects of it, right? So therefore, the children know that they can always give this guy food. Yeah.
Unless I missed it. You make the distinction a little bit between a child who's like 5 or 6 or a child who's 11 or 12.
Correct.
Correct.
So he says that his initial point that he made was that it seemed that the Shulchan Aruch had made a point of saying that even an adult child does not have a right to lend out certain utensils that belong to his father. And what Rav Stern is basically saying is, when we're dealing with adult children, a teenager over bar mitzvah the child has das, the only time that they don't have permission to lend out their father's items is if there's no established pattern of giving away this thing or lending it out. But if once there's an established pattern, then the adult child, or the child with das, does have permission. A child without das, then it would all depend on the understanding in the household. Even a child without das, an 8-year-old child, a 10-year-old child, could also offer something to a guest, right? As long as it's understood that this asset of mine is meant to be shared with others.
But also, is it from his age, the boy was considered dumber as a child?
He's an adult
He's an adult.
once he's bar mitzvah, yeah.
Right. So when you're saying teenager, those that were really teenagers.
A teenager would be an adult. A teenager would be an adult, yeah. Okay. He says, "V'im kein lefi zeh nireh pashut hu hadin v'kol sheken le'nishtamshus b'chafetzav shel bal habayis." He says, then if a child has the liberty to serve food to guests, which is a consumable, certainly the child has the right to lend out items that belong to the father when he has demonstrated that he wants to share these with others. Because it's not a consumable, okay? So now he's going to go a little bit further just to go through the just reconciling all of these the different commentaries. So we're not going to go into that as well. Let's just go on to the next piece, and we'll take a look at this next biurim. He quotes from the Shulchan Aruch in Orach Chaim, Simin Taf Reishin and Ches Sif Hey, Kasav HaMechaber, the Imnasnu Lo Stam, Avi Ki'ilu Omer Lo Almanas Shetachzirehu Li. He says, just see. I believe that this is talking about the Arba Minim. Let me just take a look at the Likutim first. Shoel Shalomidas. He says you're not allowed to borrow something without the knowledge of the owner. So you can't make assumptions unless you know for certain that he doesn't mind. V'im yesh isur zeh eitzel nachri, nechleku bazeh haposkim, v'ayin la'el simen zayin b'biurim sifchav gimel v'chein kol. Whether this applies to a Gentile, borrowing a Gentile's items without his knowledge, whether you're considered a Goslin or not, is something that's debated by the poskim. But you have to assume, you have to be machmir. Sefer shetzulam b'li reshus ba'olim imrashayim lilmod bo, ayin shilas atshuvas minchas yitzchak chelek zayin simin kuf lamed. What if there's a sefer that was published without permission of the author? Are you allowed to? You have a book that was published without permission of the author. Are you allowed to read it? He says, take a look at Shilas Teshuvas Minchas Yitzchak Chelek Zayin Simin Kuf Lamed. We'll save that for perhaps after Pesach. Just as a reminder, we're not going to be learning we're not learning tomorrow, and we won't be learning over Chol HaMoed. We'll give you a break, and we'll resume after Pesach. Okay. So let's take a look at the Shulchan Aruch and Siman Taf Reish Nun Ches. Let me just bring that up. It's published without the author's permission.
Yeah. Everybody knows that in the community, and they still want to buy books to find. That's the question.
Well, I'll tell you something. I had a situation when I published the Kuzari many years ago. Shulchan Aruch, Siman Taf Reish Nun Ches, which is 658. I'll tell you my story in a minute. 658, and it's Taf Reish Nun Ches Sif Hey. Well, it's taken a long time to load. That's unusual. It's talking about the Arba Minim on Sukkos. I don't know why it's taking so long to load. Um, but he quotes the Shulchan Aruch as saying, "Dimnasno lo stam havikilu omer lo almanas shetachzirehu li." It's talking about a person who's borrowing here. Let's take a look. Shulchan Aruch writes, "You're not Yotze on the first day unless it belongs to you." Okay? Nasnu lo almanas lahachziro hareze Yotze bo yedei chovaso umachziro. That if you don't have a lulav and I do, and I want you to be Yotze, so I give it to you, but I say it's yours, but you have to return it to me. So you can be Yotze, and then you have to return it to me, because that's what's called a matana almanas lahachzir, a gift with the assumption that you're going to return the gift after you've used it. Now, nasno lo stam havikiilu omerlo almanas shetachzirehuli. If I give you my lulav on the first day, when you have to own the lulav in order to be Yotze, and then I give it to you without saying anything, it's implicit that it's as if I'm saying, I expect it back. Demistama al das kein nasnu lo, kevin shetzarach lotzeis bo she'en lo acher, v'im lo hechziro lo yatsa. And he says, because that's implicit, that when I give it to you, I'm giving it to you so you should own it during the period when you want to be Yotzei the mitzvah. But it's also understood that you're going to return it to me, because I don't have another one that I can fulfill the mitzvah with afterwards. If you don't return it to me, so then you're not Yotzei the mitzvah because you've stolen it. Okay. But let's say you don't give it back to me right away. You give it to your friend, and your friend gives it to his friend. And because in the old shtetelach, there was only one, they had one. Yeah. So the one usher gets the lulav and esrog, and he gives it to his friend, and his friend gives it to his friend, and it goes down the whole shul until it gets back to me. He says, then everyone is Yotze, because as long as it got back to the original owner, so then it's fine. Now, before we go into any further detail, so let's see where he's going with this. He says, okay. The cost of Sham HaMishnah Berurah, Sif Katan, Chaf Aleph is Elishana. Umihu muchach lichora midin zeh, de mekabel matan manas lahachzir, yesh lo rishus lachzor v'litin l'chol mi sheyirtze ad kan l'sham. The Mishnah Berurah writes something this is at face value a little bit troublesome. He writes that if I give you a gift that's meant to be a temporary gift, but I expect you to give it back to me afterwards, you have the right to share it with others during that period while it's in your possession. That's what the Mishnah Berurah writes. Uvashar hatziyun sham heir de efshir de zerak b'makom mitzvah, aval bishar dvarim ein ze barur. The Shar Tzion writes that's only true when the article is a mitzvah item, that people do a mitzvah with it. Because there we assume that the owner is happy for other people to do the mitzvah. But if I give you a temporary gift with the expectation of getting it back, but it's a lawnmower, and it's not something that you do a mitzvah with, so then it's not clear that just because I gave it to you as a gift with the expectation of getting it back, that you have a right to give it to others. Al kol panim b'makom mitzvah yotze midvarav devadayu pashat d'shori litin gam la'acherim. But you see from here that it's not just a loan; it's a gift. And when it's a gift to you, because I have to give it to you for it to be yotze, the mitzvah of Arba Minim on the first day of Sukkot. So then you're allowed to. It seems obvious to the Mishnah Berurah that you're allowed to give it to other people as long as it makes its way back to you. Ve'ein lahakshos al hada kasav aprima gadam be'aviu abir halacha siman tafrei shlam and zayin that im echad shal lachabero latish that there's a case the Bir Halacha raises. What if a person borrows a beam of wood from his friend, let's say to use for a support for the schach in the sukkah? I lend you a beam, and you take that beam, and instead of using it in your sukkah, you lend it to your friend so that he can use it. So I give it to Reuven, and Reuven gives it, instead of Reuven using it himself, he gives it to Shimon. So there, the Shulchan Aruch seems to say that Shimon is a Gazlan, and he's not Yotzei, his mitzvah of sukkah, because you can't be Yotzei in a sukkah that's stolen. So what's the difference in the case of the Arba Minim, where other people can be Yotzei, because we assume that the owner wants other people to have it, versus the beam? He says, Ulam be'emes de'ein ze kushya klal. He says it's not really a problem. The shiny hasam do kibel es esrog b'matana mamish. Benasa love bailim v'havilachem. All right, this is what I had assumed. The answer seems to be fairly obvious. In the case of the lulav and esrog, it's a gift. It's a temporary gift, but it's clear that it is being given so that it is in your ownership during the time that you have it. Because you are not a borrower, but you are the temporary owner, you occupy a different status in halacha, right? And that's the reason why when you are the temporary owner, you're allowed to give it to somebody else because it's totally yours when it's in your possession. And then you can certainly give it to somebody else, provided as long as it makes its way back to me. But in the case of the beam for the sukkah, I didn't give it to you as a gift. I lent it to you because you're not obligated to own your sukkah in order to be yotzei. It's different from the Arba Minim. And that's why they write over there that you're not allowed to lend it to others. He says, but what's the svara? Why not say that the owner would be happy for his beam to be used for a mitzvah, even if it's only on loan? He says that's also not a problem. Because if you recall, what did we say? If you take the object outside of the venue that I gave it to you to use it in, then you can't assume that the owner is happy with that. So if I lend you something and I assume it's going to be in your backyard, and you instead take it and give it to that guy for his backyard, that makes the owner uptight. That the owner never agreed to. Even if it's for a mitzvah. Just like if I left my talis in shul, I certainly don't mind if you use my talis while it's in shul. Remember, we said you can't take the talis out of the shul and take it home with you. That makes the owner uptight. Because we have to assume maybe the owner doesn't want someone else handling it if it's taken off the premises. And therefore, if the shoel wants to lend a mitzvah item to somebody else, he can, but only while it's in his home. Now we can understand why the first borrower of the beam cannot lend it to another guy for his sukkah because it's in a different backyard. And now let's go back to our esrog case. Yes, the same thing will apply. If I give you an esrog and it's yours, you therefore have a right to give it to other people to use, but we have to restrict it, right? I gave you the gift, let's say, to use it in shul. And if you want to give it to another guy in shul, as long as it gets back to me at the end, that's fine. But if there's a long line and they're taking it to the other shtibel, right, down the road, that you don't have a right to do. But maybe not. Maybe you could even be more lenient over there because it was given as a full gift. Because it totally belongs to the person who received it as a gift. And maybe there's even room to be lenient for it to be taken off the premises as well.
We were talking yesterday, we were mentioning about how people shake a lulav, and it's fragile. So if he's going to have the opportunity or the right to sort of hand it off to different people, some people are a little bit more sensitive when it's not their own property, or how they're handling things with others. So
when I first moved here, I told a story at my opening drasha. I said that there was the Rav of the town had passed away. They needed a new Rav. So there was a Talmud Chacham who was a balabas who lived in the city, and they approached him to become the new rabbi. And he didn't want it. And his wife started to shepherd him. Why don't you take it? She shepherded him. He said, okay, I'll become the new rabbi on one condition. We're a small town. No one has enough money to afford their own esrog. If you buy me the esrog for the town this year, then I'll agree. So she goes to her kneppel, the little cookie jar where she's been hiding all of her spare money, and she takes her savings and she spends a lot of money to buy the one esrog for the town for that year. So everyone is so impressed. This balabas has the one esrog in the town, and everyone borrows the esrog, and it gets passed around every single day. Now, as you can imagine, by the last day, by Hoshana Rabbah, this esrog had a few brown spots, was a little soft in a few places, had a lot of fingerprints on it. So the guy takes it at the end and he says, if this is what you want me to look like in 5 years, then I'll become the rabbi. So,
I'm glad for more than twice that time the rabbi looks very good.
Thank you. It's amazing what plastic surgery will do. So anyway, so just to respond to you, you're right. You have to remember that back then, people were not as mindful about their possessions when it came to doing a mitzvah. The quality of pristine of a condition that their mitzvah items were in was not like we expect today. Today, people spend hours looking for the perfect esrog. Then you got something that was half decent. You took it, and it didn't bother you for other people to use it. Standards have changed a lot. And the same thing is true with tefillin and talis. A guy spends a lot of money on a pair of tefillin. Maybe you can't make the assumption that he'd be happy for someone to use it if it's a really, really super expensive pair of tefillin. But in most cases, you still can. You can, but with Arba Minim, all I wanted to suggest was that maybe you can no longer make that assumption that someone would be happy to borrow it, because today, number one, Arba Minim sets are ubiquitous, so they're much more easily accessed. So there's no assumption that someone's just going to pick up my Arba Minim. And number two, people do mishandle it, and they are fragile. So anyway, but I guess.
We're going to get to the story before that. But when you were puncturing the story.
Yeah, I mean, I did have a story, but we're sort of out of time. But just remind me to tell you, after Pesach, there was a publisher who I held back the rights from, and because they sold the company that they sold to actually went ahead and republished the book without my permission, and they didn't own the copyright. And I had to sue them, and I got a nice piece of change because of it. But I'll tell you the whole story later.
Hmm.
Chag Sameach, everybody.